fool's rule. This is not a cynical observation. It is a pattern so consistent across history, across institutions, across every kind of organization you have ever been part of, that it demands an explanation rather than a dismissal. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the most intelligent one. Think about that for a moment. Not the most knowledgeable, not the most experienced, not the person who has studied the problem the longest or thought about it most carefully. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who is most certain. And certainty, as Niccolò Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago, has almost nothing to do with being right. You have seen this. You have watched someone of breathtaking mediocrity climb past people who are better, sharper, more capable in every measurable way. And you told yourself it was politics, or luck, or the right connections at the right time. Maybe it was all of those things. But beneath all of those things, there was something else. A deeper mechanism that Machiavelli mapped in detail and that most people never bother to read because they find what he says too uncomfortable to sit with. Here is what he found. Being smart is sometimes exactly what stops you from gaining power. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough that the pattern deserves a name and an explanation, and most importantly, a defense. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469 and spent the most productive years of his life as a diplomat and civil servant in the Florentine Republic. He was brilliant, practical, and deeply observant. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, he was arrested, tortured, and exiled to his farm outside the city. It was there, stripped of everything he had built, that he wrote The Prince, not as a celebration of ruthlessness, but as a precise, unflinching description of how power actually operates in the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. In chapter 18 of The Prince, he wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." By the end of this, you will understand exactly what he meant. You will see the mechanism by which incompetence rises while intelligence waits. You will understand the specific trap that moral intelligence sets for itself. And you will encounter the distinction, the one Machiavelli drew that most readers miss, that separates the person who performs power from the person who genuinely holds it. The stage is already set. The question is whether you know you are standing on it. Part 1. The performance. Most people are watching the play. The rare person is watching the actor. Every social environment is a stage. This is not a metaphor Machiavelli invented. It is a description of a mechanism he observed operating in every court, every council chamber, every room where power was being negotiated. People present versions of themselves. They manage their image. They control what others see, selectively and strategically, in ways that often have very little relationship to what is actually true about them. What Machiavelli recognized, and what made The Prince so scandalous to its first readers, was that this performance is not a corruption of power. It is a precondition of it. The prince who actually is good, he argued, is more vulnerable than the prince who merely appears good, because the prince who appears good can adapt his appearance to circumstances. The prince who actually is good has no such flexibility. He is constrained by the very virtue he embodies. This leads directly to a dynamic that most people experience but few can name. Genuine competence tends to come with a set of cognitive habits that are liabilities in performance terms. The truly knowledgeable person acknowledges what they do not know. The genuinely experienced leader names the complexity of the problem rather than flattening it into a slogan. The honest expert says, "It depends," where the confident impostor says, "I have the answer." And in any environment where the audience is watching a performance rather than evaluating substance, These habits of intellectual honesty read as weakness. Socrates understood this too late. His famous declaration, that he knew only that he knew nothing, made him the most philosophically serious figure in Athenian history. It also got him sentenced to death by a democracy that preferred decisive certainty to uncomfortable questions. His intellectual humility was real. It was also in the political arena lethal. He questioned, they answered. He complicated, they simplified. He pointed at the difficulty, they pointed at the enemy. His intellectual humility cost him everything. The demagogues who followed him offered simple answers and inherited the earth. This is not an accident of ancient history. The Dunning-Kruger effect, the psychological phenomenon in which people with limited knowledge dramatically overestimate their own competence, while genuine experts systematically underestimate theirs, has been documented across dozens of studies and replicated across cultures. Experts are uncertain because they understand how much they do not know. Non-experts are confident precisely because they do not know enough to know what they are missing. And here is the brutal consequence. In any social environment where confidence signals competence, and most environments operate exactly this way, the expert and the impostor are not on equal footing. The impostor has a structural advantage. They are performing certainty without the cognitive interference of actually knowing how uncertain the situation is. The expert's accuracy is a liability. Their awareness of complexity reads as hesitation. Their honesty about the limits of their knowledge reads as doubt. And doubt in a performance is disqualifying. Watch the body language of someone who genuinely does not know the answer versus someone who has never considered that they might not know. The first person hesitates, qualifies, searches. The second person delivers. And the audience, the organization, the electorate, the investment committee, reads the delivery as the substance. The performance is the message. The stage is the argument. Machiavelli was not the first person to notice this, but he was the first person to describe it without flinching and to ask the harder question. If this is how power actually works, what does that mean for the person who wants to use it wisely, rather than merely acquire it? That question leads to something darker, because the performance is only the beginning. What happens after the performer gains the stage is where the mechanism becomes truly self-sustaining. Part 2. The director's casting. Weak leaders do not just fail to find good people, they actively avoid them. Once an incompetent leader gains power, Machiavelli observed something that modern organizational psychology has now confirmed in considerable empirical detail. They do not simply struggle to find capable people to surround themselves with. They systematically select against them. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." He meant this as a diagnostic tool for outside observers, but it is also a description of the mechanism from the inside. Insecure leaders surround themselves with people who are less capable, less threatening, and more dependent, not because they have consciously decided to do so, but because capable people make them feel exposed. A genuinely talented subordinate represents a permanent implicit threat. They might see through the performance. They might outperform the leader visibly. They might eventually replace them. The insecure leader's response is not to become more capable. It is to redefine the casting criteria. Suddenly, loyalty matters more than competence. Cultural fit matters more than expertise. Not asking difficult questions becomes a virtue called being a team player. This produces what organizational scientists call competence deserts, environments where the most capable people either leave or adapt downward. suppressing their actual ability to survive in a system that punishes it. The organization then loses its capacity to self-correct, because the people most likely to identify its failures are precisely the people it has driven out. History offers almost too many examples. Emperor Commodus replaced capable Roman administrators with flatterers and entertainers, accelerating a decline that would take centuries to fully manifest. Robert Mugabe systematically dismantled Zimbabwe's agricultural and economic infrastructure by replacing experienced civil servants and farmers with partisan loyalists who owed him personal allegiance. The result was an economy that had once been a regional exporter becoming unable to feed its own population. I want to say something here directly. This dynamic is not limited to dictators or obviously corrupt systems. It operates in companies, universities, hospitals, and small organizations everywhere. I have watched it happen in environments that considered themselves meritocratic. The language of meritocracy was intact. They talked constantly about excellence and high standards. But the decisions being made were consistently driven by who made the leader comfortable, rather than who was actually most capable. The meritocracy was a performance, not a reality. And the people who named that gap were the first to go. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, the ideas that don't get softened, the ones that actually ask something of you, subscribe to Wise Daily. That's what we're here for. The compounding effect of this is the most insidious part. Each generation of selection shifts the baseline. The organization that was once 30% incompetent and 70% capable gradually reverses those proportions, as each round of hiring selects for people the current leadership finds non-threatening. By the time the organization is in crisis, the people capable of diagnosing the crisis have long since left, and the people who remain genuinely cannot see what went wrong because they were selected precisely for their inability to see it. This is why Machiavelli's observation about the men around a ruler is so useful. It is not just a diagnostic for historical leaders. It is a tool for evaluating any environment you are considering entering. Look carefully at who has risen, who has stayed, and who has left. The pattern of that population is the most honest description of the system's values you will ever find, far more honest than any mission statement or stated culture. But there is a third dimension to this that Machiavelli identified, and it is the one that most directly concerns the intelligent person trying to navigate it. Because the incompetent leader's advantage is not just the performance and the casting. It is that principled intelligence has a specific vulnerability, one that the person without principles does not share. Part 3. The trap of principle. The person willing to cross the line has access to strategies the principled person has forbidden themselves. This is Machiavelli's most disturbing insight, and the one most often misread as an endorsement of ruthlessness. In chapter 15 of The Prince, he wrote, "It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity." He's not saying that the prince should be bad. He is saying that the prince must be able to be bad when necessity demands it, and that the prince who cannot do this has surrendered a category of strategic option that their less principled opponents have not surrendered. In any competitive environment, the person willing to make promises they have no intention of keeping has an advantage over the person who keeps their word. The person willing to use deception has access to information asymmetry that the honest person does not. The person willing to exploit fear and tribal identity can mobilize forces that the person constrained by truth cannot touch. This is not a moral argument, it is a description of an asymmetry that exists whether or not we acknowledge it. The principled person plays by rules that their opponent has quietly set aside. The honest person discloses constraints that the dishonest person conceals. The morally careful person hesitates at exactly the moment their opponent acts. Cicero versus Julius Caesar is the historical test case Machiavelli would have cited. Cicero was the more brilliant mind, a legal genius, a philosophical writer of genuine depth, one of the great orators in any language. Caesar was, among other things, willing to cross the Rubicon, literally. The act that gave us the phrase was a deliberate violation of Roman constitutional law, a move that Cicero, bound by his principles and his belief in the Republic, would never have made. He was constrained by his own virtue in a contest where virtue was not the deciding variable. Caesar made it, won, and wrote history. Cicero wrote beautiful letters and was eventually executed. Modern research in organizational psychology has produced findings that are uncomfortable for anyone who wants to believe that virtue is reliably rewarded. Studies from the University of British Columbia have found that psychopathic traits, specifically the combination of charm and lack of empathy, are positively associated with rapid career advancement in corporate environments. Not with performance, with advancement. The two are distinct. This creates what game theorists call a race to the bottom. When unethical tactics prove successful, others face pressure to adopt similar approaches or fall behind. Over time, this can transform an entire system, not through any single dramatic corruption, but through the gradual normalization of each small compromise, until the compromise is the culture. But here is what Machiavelli also understood, and what his critics have consistently missed. This is a description of a pathology, not a prescription for one. He was not writing to the unscrupulous leader to help them be more effectively unscrupulous. He was writing to the intelligent person who wants to understand the actual mechanism of power. Because you cannot design a system that resists manipulation if you refuse to acknowledge how manipulation works. The intelligent person's trap is not that they are moral. It is that they assume the environment rewards what they reward in themselves. They assume the stage is evaluating substance when it is evaluating performance. They assume the director is selecting for competence when the director is selecting for compliance. They play by rules that the system has already discarded, and they call their resulting disadvantage unfairness, when in reality, it is information they have failed to use. Understanding this is the beginning of the way out. Part 4. The Playwright's Advantage. There is a particular quality of stillness that comes to a person once they have genuinely understood what Machiavelli was describing. Not cynicism, not bitterness. Something more useful than either of those things. Clarity. Clarity about what the environment is actually selecting for. Clarity about where the performance ends and the substance begins. Clarity about the specific conditions under which merit can prevail, and the specific conditions under which it cannot and will not, no matter how hard you work or how right you are. The insight is this: the actor is constrained by the script. The director is constrained by the budget. But the playwright, the person who understands the underlying architecture of the stage, is constrained only by their understanding of the system. Machiavelli's fundamental argument in The Prince is not that you should be ruthless. It is that you should be clear-eyed. You should understand how power actually moves through a system, not how you would like it to move. Because a clear-eyed person operating in a broken system can make better decisions than a well-intentioned person who does not understand the system they are in. The clear-eyed person recognizes when the environment cannot be changed from within and leaves before it costs them more than the leaving. They recognize when a system is healthy enough to reward competence and invest accordingly. They understand the difference between a leader who selects for capability and a leader who selects for deference. and they know which one to follow and which one to avoid before the evidence is catastrophic. Most importantly, the clear-eyed person understands accountability structures. Machiavelli was obsessively interested in whether power was accountable to consequences. The surgeon who loses patients loses their practice. The bridge engineer whose structures collapse loses their license. These feedback loops are ruthless and accurate. They correct for incompetence with brutal efficiency. But the politician whose bad decisions can be blamed on predecessors, or the executive whose creative accounting obscures the damage for 4 quarters, or the leader whose media management turns every failure into someone else's fault. These people operate in environments where the feedback loop has been severed. Jung wrote in his later work that the most important task of the second half of life is individuation, becoming who you actually are, rather than who you were shaped to perform. Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately. The prince who has confused their performance with their identity is the most dangerous kind, because when the performance fails, they have nothing left to fall back on. The person who knows who they are beneath the role they play is the one who survives the stage's eventual collapse. You cannot change the stage by being the best actor. You change it by learning who is writing the script. Most of us enter the world believing that merit will eventually be recognized, that the clearest thinking, the deepest competence, and the most honest assessment will eventually prevail. Machiavelli did not share this belief, and 5 centuries of political history have largely vindicated his skepticism. But he also believed that understanding the mechanism was itself a form of power. You cannot change the stage by being the best actor. You change it by learning who is writing the script. Where in your own life have you been playing by rules the system quietly abandoned? If that landed, type "I see the stage" in the comments. Not for me, but for you. And if this video gave you something real, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Wise Daily. Every video on this channel is built to give you one thing: the philosophical tools to live with more power, more clarity, and more intention. We'll see you in the next one. Machiavelli showed us the mechanism by which performance overtakes substance in the competition for power. But there is a philosopher who asked the harder question. Once you understand the mechanism, what do you do with that understanding? How do you live well inside a system you cannot fully control? That philosopher is Marcus Aurelius. And the answer he found, alone at night during the wars he never chose to fight, is the subject of our next video.